A promise kept by fate. In the quaint English village of Hawthorne, nestled amidst rolling green hills and cobblestone streets, lived two inseparable friends, Robert and David. They had known each other since boyhood and shared countless memories of mischief, laughter, and loyalty. Both men married and settled in the village, and soon they learned that their wives were expecting children around the same time. They couldn't have been happier. One evening, as they chatted over a pint at the local inn, Robert grinned mischievously and proposed a joke. "If my wife has a son and yours a daughter, let's marry them off one day. Imagine, we'd finally be family." David chuckled, raising his glass in agreement. "Done, but on one condition, they have to get along as well as we do." Their wives laughed, rolling their eyes at the playful promise. But as fate would have it, several months later, Robert's wife gave birth to a son, Edward, a cheerful boy with a quick wit and kind heart. Meanwhile, David's wife welcomed a daughter named Elizabeth, gentle and curious, with eyes like a sparkling sea. The two families grew closer than ever, sharing the joys and challenges of raising children. When the children were just a few years old, Robert received an unexpected offer to work as a shipwright on the distant island of St. Briar. The job promised prosperity and stability for his family, so despite the ache of leaving Hawthorne Village and their beloved friends, Robert's family packed their belongings, said bittersweet farewells to David's family, and set sail for a new beginning. Before they parted, Robert and David vowed to keep in touch, promising that letters would bridge the miles between them. And for a time they did. The letters flew back and forth, each one filled with news of their children, village happenings, and fond memories. Robert shared stories of island life, while David's letters painted a vivid picture of Hawthorne, keeping their friendship alive despite the distance. But then, quite suddenly, the letters stopped. The postal ship that carried mail between St. Briar and the mainland was lost in a violent storm, and the connection was severed. As weeks turned into months without word from Robert, David grew concerned, writing letter after letter but receiving no reply. During this time, David's father, who lived in a nearby town, fell gravely ill. Urgently needing to be closer to him, David's family decided to move and take care of him. Amidst the chaos of the move and his father's illness, David thought often of Robert and missed their shared letters. But he had no choice but to focus on his family. Eventually, as time wore on, Robert's concern for his old friend grew too heavy to ignore. He decided to make the journey back to Hawthorne Village, hoping to find David and understand the silence between them. But when he arrived, he found nothing but a quiet, empty house. A neighbor explained that David's family had left months ago, moving to care for David's ailing father. He missed his friend and the bond they'd built, yet deep down, he held on to the hope that their paths might cross again someday. Standing before the empty home, he thought of the memories they'd shared and silently promised himself that he would keep looking for a way to reconnect no matter how much time passed. In the years that followed, both men settled into their new lives, but the friendship they'd shared remained in their hearts. Robert often found himself thinking of Hawthorne Village and the laughter that used to fill those simple days. For David, too, memories of his friend lingered, a fond reminder of promises and youthful dreams. After David's father passed away, his family eventually settled in the bustling city of Brighton. There, he began a new chapter, yet he couldn't shake the hope that one day he might reconnect with Robert. He attempted to write to him again, but by then, Robert's family had also moved once more, and his letters went unanswered. Still, both men, though separated by circumstance, never let go of the friendship that had once meant the world to them. As the years rolled by, their children, Elizabeth and Edward, grew up and entered King's College in London. Unbeknownst to each other, they shared a history as entwined as their parents' bond, but neither could have imagined how fate would play its hand. One afternoon, Elizabeth sat in the college library, surrounded by books on art, lost in her studies. Suddenly, someone bumped into her, sending her neatly stacked books cascading onto the floor. She looked up, annoyed, and found herself staring at a flustered young man with an apologetic smile. "Oh, I'm terribly sorry," he stammered, picking up the books with haste. His name was Edward, and he looked just as embarrassed as she was annoyed. Elizabeth sighed, her irritation fading as she caught his sheepish expression. "Next time, maybe try walking instead of charging through like a runaway horse." Edward laughed, charmed by her wit. "I'll keep that in mind, though in my defense, these books really are fascinating." They exchanged names and parted ways, but something lingered between them, a faint spark neither could quite ignore. A few weeks later, they found themselves in the same lecture hall, sitting near each other. When the professor asked Elizabeth to read a passage aloud, she stumbled nervously over the words. Edward, noticing her struggle, whispered the lines softly to help her. She shot him a grateful look, and they shared a quiet smile that lingered after class ended. They walked together, chatting about everything from poetry to the traditions of their hometowns. As they spoke, Edward casually mentioned, "I was actually born in a small village called Hawthorne." Elizabeth stopped for a moment, looking at him in surprise. "You're from Hawthorne? That's where I was born too." They both laughed, slightly taken aback by the coincidence. Though they quickly moved on to other topics, a hint of curiosity lingered between them, each wondering if this shared hometown was more than just chance. Elizabeth was taken by his kindness, and Edward was drawn to her intelligence and charm. The conversation flowed naturally as they continued walking, unaware of how intertwined their pasts truly were. Their paths continued to cross in amusing ways. At an art exhibit on campus, Edward leaned a bit too close to a sculpture, causing it to wobble dangerously. Horrified, Elizabeth rushed to steady it with him, only to end up tangled in an awkward yet endearing attempt to balance the artwork. They both laughed, and in that shared laughter, they felt something deepen between them. Over time, their meetings became intentional, their friendship blossoming into romance. They found solace and joy in each other's company, unaware of the promise that had once tied their families together. After a year together, Elizabeth and Edward felt it was finally time for their parents to meet. They planned a quiet, intimate dinner, expecting nothing more than a pleasant evening. As they each arrived at the restaurant, they had no idea of the extraordinary surprise awaiting them. Elizabeth arrived first with her father, David, and her mother, Margaret. David joked easily as they waited, while Margaret adjusted Elizabeth's collar with a proud smile, occasionally glancing toward the door with anticipation. Moments later, Edward arrived with his father, Robert, and mother, Anne. As they stepped into the room, David and Robert's eyes met, and instantly the atmosphere changed. Both men froze, their expressions a mix of surprise, disbelief, and the beginning of joyous recognition. Robert? David stammered, barely able to speak. David? Is that really you? Robert replied, his voice thick with emotion. The entire room seemed to pause as the two men took in the sight of each other, old memories flooding back in an instant. Elizabeth and Edward looked back and forth between their fathers, trying to piece together the unfolding mystery. Slowly, David and Robert approached each other, each step rekindling the friendship they'd once shared. The two men embraced tightly, their laughter mixed with tears, and the silence broke as the families looked on in surprise and delight. Margaret turned to Anne with a knowing smile. Well, it looks like fate finally decided to act on that old promise of theirs, she whispered, sharing in the warmth of the moment. As the realization dawned on Elizabeth and Edward, they exchanged astonished glances. Wait, you two know each other? Elizabeth asked, still processing the unexpected reunion. Robert, wiping a tear from his eye, looked at the young couple with a joyful, nostalgic smile. Know each other? My dear, your father and I have been the best of friends for as long as I can remember. David chuckled, glancing over at Elizabeth and Edward. And not just that. We had a dream, a promise really, that if one of us had a son and the other a daughter, well, we joked about marrying them off one day. Elizabeth and Edward's eyes widened in disbelief, the pieces finally falling into place. So you mean, this was all planned? Edward asked, laughing in amazement. David shrugged, his eyes twinkling. More of a whimsical wish than a plan, but look at you both now. As laughter and happy tears filled the room, the families shared stories and memories, celebrating the beautiful coincidence that had brought them back together. Elizabeth and Edward held hands under the table, understanding that their love story was rooted in a friendship that transcended time and distance. The evening ended with a toast to friendship, family, and the little whims of fate that had guided their lives full circle. And as they clinked their glasses, David and Robert exchanged a final, knowing smile, a silent promise that this time they'd keep their families close.